and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. On the show today is Toby Mendel, who is the Executive Director of the C4L Democracy, which is a non-profit human rights organization based in Canada working on foundational rights for democracy, which include the right to information and freedom of expression. He's in town today for the launch of the report he authored titled The Malaysia Media Law Reform Blueprint. Toby, welcome to the show. It's good of you to join me. Thank you.
Great pleasure to be here.
Right, so I want to talk a little bit first before we get into kind of the report and other recent developments in the news. Maybe for the benefit of our audience tonight, Toby, you can briefly share what it is that the Centre for Law and Democracy focuses on and how your work or its work impacts global discourse on freedom of expression and right to information.
Okay, sure. So we're a human rights organization, as you mentioned. We're basically a legal outfit. So we focus on law reform, but also a much wider package around that. For example, capacity building and awareness raising around law reform. We also help develop international standards in those areas. So, you know, if you look at the International Guarantee of Freedom of Expression, it's literally one small paragraph. So, you know, but it has implications for so many different areas of life, like broadcasting, like digital communications and things. So we help elaborate the meaning of that. So we do a wide range of activities in the sort of legal space. And in terms of our impact, I mean, we often work with governments to advise them on legislation. Sometimes we draft legislation. So, for example, I'm working in Fiji at the moment, helping them draft a new right to information law. You know, I would say we've had quite a lot of impact in different ways in different countries around the world. We work globally, so I was going to say in every country. We don't work in every country, but we theoretically could work in every country. We certainly work in every region of the world. Okay.
And what about your work here in Malaysia? How do you collaborate with the people already in Malaysia to build capacity, as you mentioned?
Yes, so our main partner here is the Centre for Independent Journalism, CIJ. We've been working with them for, well, since we were founded. We were founded in 2010. Before that, I ran the law program at Article 19, and we work with them back then as well. So we've worked, I mean, for example, you have two right to information laws at the state level here in Malaysia, and we worked with, you know, helped develop those legislation, working with CIJ. We've done a lot of capacity building. We were involved in the August consultation that your government had on the right to information. I was here in the country for that. So we've engaged in a lot of different
So you've got a long history here, and I'm curious to get into the law reform, the media law reform blueprint. But before that, I wanted to maybe zoom out and take a look at what's happening globally, well, specifically in the US. Recently, Meta came to the decision to scale back content moderation and fact-checking in the US. And that I thought was quite interesting because it was framed as prioritizing free expression. How do you view it? How do you read it?
Yeah, so first of all, it's not just in the US, it's globally. So countries around the world are going to be affected by this, including Malaysia.
Even though it's only, as Mark Zuckerberg said, that it's only content moderation for the US, it will have a ripple effect?
The fact-checking operations, I think, are being scaled back around the world.
Around the world.
Yeah. So, and I mean, the context for this, I think we have to see it in light of the new administration that's coming in the US, which has taken a very laissez-faire attitude towards social media. Obviously, Elon Musk, a major social media mogul, is a key player within that government. These moves save Facebook a lot of money because fact checkers and content moderators are expensive. It's you know, on the human side of things, it's an important part of their personnel costs, if you will. So they're you know, they like to scale that back. I mean, there's a very simplistic, crude view of freedom of expression, which says, you know, anything goes, and we're just going to let anything go, and that's freer than if we tried to control it. But there are other views of freedom of expression. For example, if people are so inundated with false information that they don't actually know what's true, then their ability to express themselves, their ability to engage in democracy, in social life, is seriously undermined. So the values of freedom of expression depend on people understanding what's true and what's not true. So if Facebook operates in a way that, there's just, flowing false information on their platform, and people are unaware what's true and what's not true, their freedom of expression, their ability to express themselves sensibly, usefully, is seriously undermined. So I think we have to move away from a very simplistic view of free speech, which just says, say whatever you like, to a slightly more sophisticated thing, which is, knowledge and understanding are all part of our ability to express ourselves sensibly.
The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, he said that there is a responsibility to regulate content, and that regulating content is not censorship. And I thought that was quite interesting, looking at the international standards of what it means to have freedom of expression, to have free speech. And that he also pointed to the fact that allowing hate speech and harmful content online has real-world consequences. How do you view that, the risk of framing free expression as an absolute right in the digital age?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with that idea that we need to regulate content up to a point. We need to appropriately regulate content, of course, and I mean, the devil is in the details with this, how to get that balance right. For example, if there is so much misogynist speech online that it's difficult for women to speak online, and that kind of is the world that we live in, then women's free speech, and not only women's free speech, because women find it more difficult to speak because they're attacked if they speak, certainly if they speak boldly. I mean, that's pretty much a given for a woman. But also all of our rights to hear what those women have to say. I can't hear the women that don't speak, and so I'm deprived of my right to free speech, which also includes my right to receive information. So, I mean, you have to look at it in a slightly more complicated way. So hate speech drives certain groups out of the speaking space. Yeah. So, undermines their speech and undermines those of us who want to hear what they have to say. As I just described, disinformation confuses people, so they can speak, but what they're saying doesn't mean anything because it's not tethered to reality. So I mean, I think that, those problems online, and those problems are boosted structurally by the platforms. They benefit from engagement. And unfortunately, people seem to engage more with hateful content, with disinformation. In the disinformation space, you can say anything. You can say really exciting, interesting things because you don't have to be limited to the true things. That's, by definition, not as interesting or as sexy or as exciting. So I think, so we need the platforms to stop boosting those kinds of harmful speech. It's not a free speech environment if they're systematically boosting certain kinds of speech and diminishing other kinds of speech. You say something true and they ignore it. You say something false and there they boost it up. So, I mean, I think it's very simplistic for, Zuckerberg, for example. I mean, so we need to regulate it in a way that doesn't undermine free speech and yet enables free speech, but not so much that certain kinds of things can't be said.
When you're watching the US, and I think it's important because when we look at the US, it really sets the tone sometimes for kind of global trends and policy worldwide. When you look at the US and Trump's return to presidency, what specific changes or trends do you anticipate regarding issues around freedom of expression, freedom of speech?
Yeah, I mean, one of the characteristics of Trump is that, I mean, you never know what's going to come out. He's the master of chaos, and so it's very, very difficult to predict. Like although I can look back and tether the Facebook decision to the new environment under Trump, I wouldn't have predicted it. So it's difficult. I think we're in a world now, and not just because of Trump and the chaotic administration that, chaos is the buzzword of his previous administration, and it's going to be even more so, I think, in this administration. But we're also in a world where the technology is moving so quickly. AI is upon us. 5 years ago, hardly anybody was talking about AI, and now you can't, get 5 sentences into a digital discussion without mentioning it. And AI is like enormously transformative, and it's going to continue to be like that. So I think, it's very, very difficult to have a crystal ball and look forward.
Do you see trends, though, around the world when it comes to the way what's happening in the US is influencing other countries, how it might even trickle down and influence Malaysia, the situation here in Malaysia as well?
So, but the US is one significant pole of power, obviously a very influential, and in the news today with the inauguration of the president. But the EU is also another significant player, and the EU has taken a very, very different approach. So the European Union adopted the Digital Services Act, which came into force in November of 2022. And there they are taking a very, as I mentioned, very different approach, and they are actually imposing quite onerous obligations on platforms to address exactly the problems I was talking about. So whereas the US has moved really to a kind of a Wild West environment, the very opposite is true in the European Union, and they are, they've finally started to regulate these platforms and to place some fairly significant obligations on them. So we have very different approaches even in the highly developed democracies of the world. And so it's kind of, and the gap between them is getting greater. But I would say a lot of other countries are more in the European Union fold. For example, my country, Canada, also has legislation along those lines, or draft legislation. The UK, Australia, so more countries are in the European Union camp, to be honest.
What about Malaysia? What have you observed in the way Malaysia approaches the digital space?
Right. So Malaysia just adopted the online safety bill in December, and the report, which I'll just flash up for your viewers, it's available online, obviously. I'm quite critical of the approach that Malaysia took in that bill. Basically, that bill is a notice and takedown approach. You notify that content is harmful, and there's a list of harmful content, and there's a bunch of problems with the bill, but the basic approach is that. And then one by one, you kind of take down piecemeal, oh, that one's bad, that one's bad, that one's bad, we'll take it down. I mean, you're never going to address the problems in that way. The ability of those people who want to disseminate that kind of harmful content they'll outplay you easily all of the time. You need the platforms to be taking a more structural approach, and the Malaysian bill doesn't do that. Now, the problem for Malaysia is that Malaysia has so far never stood up an independent media regulator. All of the regulators in media, so the MCMC is, totally controlled by government, all appointed by the minister can remove them at will, et cetera, et cetera. So, and you cannot approach the structural regulation of the platforms without having an independent regulator. It'll just be political and biased, and the platforms won't engage with it. So it won't work. That won't work either. So I think Malaysia really has to do some deep thinking. If you really want to address this problem, you've got to kind of move forward in democracy terms, because international law requires the regulation of the media to be done by independent actors, not to be done by government actors.
What do you think of the Media Council then, the idea for a self-regulating body in Malaysia? So
I am very, very supportive of that idea as a general idea. It exists in countries around the world. Your neighbor, Indonesia, has a wildly successful example of what I would call a co-regulatory approach. So a system which is largely run by the media, but yet has legislation backstopping it. So a pure self-regulatory approach would be where the media just set it up all by themselves without any legislation. Indonesia, like the Media Council bill here, has a co-regulatory approach. It's been very, very successful there. It's helped promote more professional media standards. It's given citizens some redress, and yet it balances freedom of expression quite nicely. So the basic idea is a great idea. the Media Council and the board, which governs the Media Council, is in your legislation is fairly independent. There's still provision for 2 government representatives, and I mean, you just, you know, your government can't quite get away from that idea. We need at least a couple of people on there. I mean, I really strongly advise them to move away from that. There is no need for government representatives on a body like that, but at least the main thrust of it, most of the representatives there, you know, are put there by the media, and it's a media body, which is what it should be. So I think it's promising. It's more promising than, you know, what we've seen. Otherwise in Malaysia, a little bit of improvements, and I think the design of the legislation needs to be tightened up. It's not quite, some of the concepts need to be
Can I ask you, Toby, based on your work in other countries, developing countries, countries that may not have as robust institutions upholding freedom of expression and freedom to assembly and the right to information, when they are seeking to reform or make change, how incremental are these reforms, are these changes, is the progress? And I'm asking because often in Malaysia the situation is activists and civil society will push for reforms, and they want the most radical, the best, the most extreme, aligning to international standards, whereas the political reality is that it costs political capital to make reforms for the government, and therefore change is always incremental from the view of the government. What have been your observations in how change takes place? What's your theory of change in terms of how quickly a country can strengthen its freedom of information rights?
So I will go back to Indonesia with this one, because I think Indonesia, you know, it's right next to you. You more or less share a common language, and there's, I mean, a lot of parallels. You're within the ASEAN group. In 1998, you know, Indonesia had a revolution. They overthrew a very repressive, media unfriendly government, and I mean, they progressed very rapidly. I myself was in Indonesia in November of 1998. I worked very closely through UNESCO with the government to draft a new press law. So they you know, threw out their old press law. They did not incrementally amend it or whatever. They ditched it, and they put in place a completely new press law, which I significantly worked on with them, and it was a very democratic one. It's the same one that established their co-regulatory system that I just mentioned. I mean, it was a dramatic change. I wouldn't call it extreme or radical. I mean, they were just coming into line with established, you know, international human rights standards. Nothing extreme about that. You could argue that it's much more extreme to be outside of that, because countries are supposed to respect human rights. And I mean, you know, and there was a lot of social upheaval, I would say. It was a challenge socially. Pushback and uncomfortability with the new freedom of expression. You know, certain religious groups, for example, you know, it took them some time to accept that this kind of free speech was going on and things. But you know, the press council, which they established, played a very, very important role in sort of mediating social disputes and helping solve those things, and helping advance the whole society on that. They established this very independent, very you know, renowned, I would say, or very sophisticated body, and they, you know, they went through that. And I would say that similar thing happened all throughout Eastern and Central Europe. You know, when communism fell at the end of the, you know, beginning of the 1990s, I mean, they did not change their systems incrementally. They changed. Yes, there was some struggle. Yes, there was some social upheaval, but they did it. And I think that Malaysia's, you know, 20 years, more than 20 years behind, you know, what happened in Indonesia. I think Malaysia's, you know, I mean, it's going to sound a little bit controversial perhaps to say this, but I mean, Malaysia's out, you know, out of time with this. I mean, you need to move, and you need to move fairly quickly.
What were the commonalities of those countries that have successfully strengthened those institutions? Was it leadership at the top? Was it a very vocal civil society? Was it create, you know, an independent regulation of the media, as you mentioned, that helped seed the ground and educate the public about the need for freedom of expression? What were the commonalities that you think Malaysia might take stock of, let's say?
Yeah, and I mean, I just want to, lest I don't want to give the wrong impression. I mean, there have been countries which have not been successful or which have moved forward and have slid, like Tunisia, like Hungary. So, I mean, it's not like every country in the world has had rapid transition and that's been successful. You know, there have been some backsliding examples. But, I mean, I think there was, I mean, an important underlying element here was a large public drive for it. So the public were demanding it, or at least the vocal public, because sometimes it's hard to distinguish. And I think in Indonesia, the Reformasi movement and things. I mean, the people were that press law had to go.
Right.
There was no way that the government, whatever it wanted to do, could keep that press law. So I think and same thing in Eastern and Central Europe, and there are countries in Africa as well. It's not just in those areas. So I think that if the public are not ultimately underpinning this, then the government will probably not be on board. But that underlying force then created the political will where these things could happen, and ultimately you need the political will. And I think we're seeing in Malaysia some weakness in the political will space. We got quite interesting promises in the election manifesto of the government back in 2022, but now there's been some resiling from that. We haven't seen those promises delivered.
So in that report, essentially it's a blueprint, but you detailed some recommendations. And I know we probably don't have enough time to go through every single one of them, because that would take several other reports and several other shows for us to cover. But there were some recommendations that you made that were quite interesting in terms of the independence of the bodies regulating the media, how to approach regulation in the digital space. If you could summarize for us what you think are the key observations that you think policymakers should prioritize in 2025.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, there's a trio of legislation that's, really colonial legislation. It's completely outdated, and it just needs to go. And that is the Sedition Act, the Official Secrets Act, and the Printing Presses and Publications Act. I mean, these laws, in my talk this morning, I referred, in the Sedition Act, it talks about exciting disaffection with the government. Who even uses the word disaffection in 2025? I mean, it makes you think of Shakespeare. It's, it's so antiquated. These laws just have no place in a modern democracy. And the government has been sort of talking about it, or talking about mitigating it or amending it or whatever. I mean, they just need to go. The government has promised a Right to Information Act, hugely important. I hope it continues with its commitment not only to adopt one of those, but to adopt a good one. It's not enough just to have one. You've got to have a good one of them. Obviously, the Media Council bill, moving forward and hopefully tightening it up and improving it a little bit. And then in the digital space, as I said, the online safety bill, I mean, it just doesn't, it's not the right approach. It's not going to work. It might make people feel that the government's doing something to address these terrible problems. And I mean, the problems online are very, very serious in countries around the world. It's not just Malaysia. We're all suffering from disinformation, from hate speech, from these bad speech things. But you need an effective approach, not a salve. A real solution.
I mean, we have about a minute left. In what you said about the right to information law, a good law as opposed to just a law. Could you just elaborate on that very quickly, what you mean by that?
Yes, so I mean, the law needs to be broad in its application. The exceptions, so obviously not all information is accessible. The exceptions need to be tight, they need to be limited, not broad and flexible, as is much of the Malaysian legislation. You need an effective, independent oversight system. So if a public authority refuses you information, you have somewhere to go, not just to the courts, because people can't go to the courts for information. It's too expensive. And you need user-friendly procedures for making requests and for responding to requests. Those are the key elements of good legislation.
Toby, thank you so much for sharing some of the work that you've done and for your years of observation here, what the trends that are happening in Malaysia. I appreciate your analysis. Thank you for your insight.
My great pleasure.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. signing off for the evening. Thanks so much for watching. Good night.